Hello, hello, everyone. Welcome to our philosophical talks with Steven Friedman, an amazing philosopher from the United States. Today, we greet you and thank you for joining us in this very interesting and very amazing day. And we have very specific topic today. It is about mental health. So stay tuned and please write down your comments. Please be engaged. And let me introduce a very special guest today. It is an honor to greet you, the Consul General of the Consulate General in Almaty, Mr. Eric Mayer.
Thank you. And as you mentioned, this is an important week and an important topic on mental health. And as always, we're very thankful to have Steven Friedman with us for the weekly philosophy talk. As you all know, Steven has spoken on a wide range of topics, and I'm particularly interested in hearing what he has to say as it relates to mental health. We're all going through very challenging times now with COVID, dealing with issues such as isolation and not being near our family or loved ones. And so I think mental health is a very timely topic. Anyway, we look forward to hearing from Steven. As you know, he is the New York Times acclaimed genius philosopher. Steven, thank you for being with us today, and look forward to hearing your discussion. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Eric. Thank you. I want to thank everyone associated with these talks at the consulate in Almaty. I appreciate this opportunity to have a weekly platform for philosophical perspectives on a wide range of topics. In general, if you've seen any of these previous talks, you know that I don't script these, and I don't, even though I have a rough outline of what I'm going to say, I don't have a detailed sequence of ideas or topics to go through. It's partly in the nature of philosophy itself that it tends to be true to every aspect of every circumstance. There's an anecdote I wanted to relay about the great 20th century philosopher Wittgenstein, who only once in his career attempted to give a prepared talk, a paper that he had written that he was going to read to a philosophical society. Well, he went up to the lectern, looked down at the paper, the words looked dead on the page. He tore it up and proceeded to talk spontaneously. So that's characteristic of the activity of philosophy. A lot of professors of philosophy that were influenced by Wittgenstein followed a similar practice in their actual lectures to their classes. Wittgenstein, notably, would not lecture per se. He would effectively think in front of his class and do new work, creative work in philosophy. That was the only type of teaching interaction that he found inspiring and that brought the material to life. I feel the same way in general, though tonight's topic is one that I do have a roadmap in mind. And given the importance of it and given the breadth of it. Now, when I think in terms of mental health, I think in terms of issues very broadly of human suffering in all dimensions. So what I wanted to do tonight is to deal with 4 major perspectives on the issue of mental health and human suffering and the solutions that they offer. One is the psychiatry. Then I want to talk a little bit about Buddhism and its approach. Then theism, basically the religious traditions that embrace the concept of a God. So that could include the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition and certain aspects of Hindu thought. And finally, the philosophic response to effectively what we're talking about, the human condition. This is a topic that goes to the core of the application of philosophy. When I started doing philosophy, as again I've mentioned previously, I was only interested in the purity of the activity. And the purity of the activity is an activity devoted only to the limit of rigor, the limit of rigorous representation, what cannot be disputed at any level from any direction, the incontrovertible. For me, that is what philosophy is. That's all that it is, but that is where its power and its majesty and its capabilities lie. I didn't know that philosophy, as I was doing it, would have any specific applications to circumstances of human life. Philosophy, as a rigorous enterprise, does not seek to make us happy. It doesn't seek to find ways of designing better bridges or better television sets or rockets or prepare better meals. All of those types of enterprises are undertaken with ends in mind. Physics has to lead to engineering capabilities that do in fact allow us to build better bridges. And if the bridges that we design based upon our physics don't support us, we'll seek a better physics. The way to say this generally is that there is something outside the field itself that serves as a test of the power and the effectiveness of its results. If molecular biology does not advance the cure of disease, we want a different molecular biology. Well, philosophy does not operate in terms of an external set of interests or demands. It seeks rigor and is indifferent to the application of that rigor in any direction. But as I mentioned last week, early on in doing the philosophy, I found that it was not only effective when it was done well and when it did achieve that limit of rigorous representation. It wasn't just effective in achieving its own sort of desired end, but it had tremendous impact upon other aspects of human life. I write aphoristically, which just means that I write in terms of concentrated statements. And I mentioned that one of those statements, selflessness, how one acts out of need, which is a statement of the fact that rigorously, we can't justify our needs, even our need for something like oxygen. The fact that we've needed it or others have needed it in various circumstances of human life doesn't mean rigorously that we need it now or tomorrow. And I know that sounds a little bit extreme of a position. Philosophy is extreme. Rigor is extreme in the same way that broad and deep solutions to the world that the religious traditions have advanced are extreme. Well, what I discovered was that an aphorism like selflessness, how one acts not out of need, was powerful enough to undercut any type of mental issue, any degree of suffering that I was experiencing. I think I gave the example of acrophobia, where that was like the main phobia that I experienced growing up. And it would manifest itself not when I was looking down from an elevation, but looking up because I saw no support. Well, one day I was looking up at office buildings that would make me feel queasy, make me feel dizzy, make me feel acrophobic. And I happened just as an experiment, because a lot of what I do, what philosophy in certain modes of its operation, the way Wittgenstein did philosophy as well, is experimental. You come up with a result and then you test it. So I happened to run just randomly an aphorism, selflessness, again, how one acts not out of need, through my mind, and the acrophobia immediately disappeared. And I found that under any condition of mental stress, emotional stress, and even physical pain, extreme types of physical pain, such as stepping on a nail, that type of experience, or breaking one's foot, I could run that aphorism through my mind and the pain would stop. And it would stop like a switch had been turned. Now, that is one of the ways, in fact, I see the philosophy is operating, as a switch, that one doesn't need to pull back from human experience. One doesn't need to isolate oneself from emotions. One doesn't need to protect oneself from negative experiences. But if the experience becomes too strong to bear, if the experience becomes too much of an attack upon our sense of self or our integrity, if it threatens us too deeply or too profoundly or too thoroughly, that I found that the philosophy was always there like a switch to free me from those circumstances. I mean, it reached the point where just knowing that the philosophical work had that power was enough that I never quite had to fully use it. Using it became a sign of failure, that it wasn't yet operating at the level that I demanded of it. Okay, so philosophy at the limit of rigor does have enormous power. And one of the things that I'm going to develop today is it has the power to achieve indisputably, not based on belief or faith or opinion or a point of view, but incontestably, it has the power to achieve what the religious traditions, what Buddhism, what Christian mysticism seeks at the limit of their aspiration in terms of addressing human suffering at its most commonplace, but also at its most extreme. One of the things that the religious traditions do, one of the things that Christianity does as an emblem, is address the issue of torture to death. That extremity of human suffering. I mean, if we have a device, if we have an approach that is strong enough to deal with torture to death, then we have something that can deal with the issues that a pandemic raises, or that isolation imposes upon us. In other words, we're looking ultimately for an extreme response that is so powerful that it can address every conceivable issue that humanity may face, may confront. Okay, so that's a little bit of a context. First, psychiatry. And I was in medical school, and so I was exposed to the medical model of mental health. And to illustrate how that model operates and what its ambitions are, I'm going to give you an anecdote, something that actually happened to me. When I was at the start of my second year in medical school, I was experiencing a number of stresses. I was going through a divorce. I was in medical school, which itself is stressful, considered one of the most stressful types of educational environments, because you're not just faced with learning a vast amount of material, but you're being sort of trained to behave in a certain way. You're being reconditioned. It's a socialization process. And any type of profound change, is inherently stressful. And my best friend in medical school, the one person that I really connected with, ended up developing cancer, rhabdomyosarcoma, during our freshman year, towards the end of our freshman year. And he died the first week of my sophomore year in medical school. And it was a profound shock to everyone in that environment. He was one of the sweetest, the gentlest, and smartest people that I've ever known. And he was the one person that was my constant companion in that environment. So he died, I was going through a divorce, and I was in medical school. That is a difficult set of issues to deal with, right? So I decided, as an experiment. Now, I had not yet been doing philosophical work, my own philosophical work. I had studied philosophy. I had started studying philosophy when I was 12, and I studied it mostly on my own, but then at Harvard, ultimately for 10 years. But then I reached the point where I needed time to develop like my own philosophical ideas, and I needed more life experience to feed into that. There was a professor actually at Harvard who said, no one should get a PhD in philosophy until at least the age of 40. Well, be that as it may, I felt that I needed time away from philosophy. So I had certain philosophical resources, but I didn't have the type of philosophical results that I do now for addressing those kinds of issues. But nevertheless, I'm not falling apart, but I was interested in the different kinds of responses that the medical environment offered to mental stress of that level. So I made an appointment to see a psychiatrist at the medical school. As a medical student, that psychiatric services were freely available. And I did so again because I was curious as to what the psychiatrist would say, what he would offer in terms of an approach or a consolation, a response to the stress I was experiencing. Well, and I selected an eminent psychiatrist. I went into his office and I told him why I was there. Death, divorce, and medical school. The meeting lasted, the essence of the meeting, the substance of it lasted a few minutes. He says to me, okay, he repeats, divorce, death of your best friend, and you're in medical school. I'd be stressed too. Do you drink? No. Well, I can give you a prescription for Valium. I personally like rum. The point is that there was no medical response to that set of circumstances. A medical response only recognizes an inappropriate, a disproportionate response to circumstance as a sign of mental illness or mental emotional need that the medical environment can address. In other words, if you're being tortured to death and you're in severe anguish, over that set of circumstances, that's an appropriate response to those circumstances. And medicine has nothing to say about an appropriate emotional response to extreme circumstances. I mean, you'll see that in a lot of advice that might be offered today or even online, about the medical response to what we're dealing with now, that it's stressful It's inherently stressful. It's a different set of circumstances, and bear that in mind and don't be hard on yourself. Now, there are some instrumental approaches to this problem before I deal a little more deeply with that psychiatric kind of response. I was talking to, I have private students. I tutor in different subjects. I help people in different academic subjects. And I have a new student who, after we had a session the other day, asked me if he could sort of get my counsel on some things other than academics. And I said, of course. And he said, he was undergoing a lot of stress because of COVID, because of the pandemic, and he wanted to, and it was affecting his ability to work, it was affecting his ability to think, to study, it was deranging his life. And I gave him some, we might call instrumentalities, some guidelines. And I suggested things like, to basically, when we're feeling overwhelmed or potentially overwhelmed, or when we're feeling that we're no longer in control, as we're not in control, really, of a pandemic of this sort. In fact, the whole point of conspiracy thinking, conspiracy theories, is to make it seem as if human beings have control over things that they really don't. So this is one of those things. We're dealing with a virus. We've dealt with things like this, or humanity has, throughout its history. The bubonic plague that first became especially prevalent starting around 1347 or so, more or less lasted hundreds of years. I mean, I find different estimates of how long its duration actually was, but certainly there were episodes of plague in the 16th century, in the 17th century. So for hundreds of years, people had to deal with that pandemic and its aftermath, which didn't fully abate until basically our understanding of the cause of it as a bacterial infection and the development of antibiotics that can in fact control it. Viruses are much more difficult to control, and it's much harder to develop therapeutic agents against viruses. So there's a sense of being out of control. So I told him very specific things, very specific guidelines to put yourself more in control. Namely, you get up in the morning and you make your bed, and you keep your environment ordered. I've experienced both types of environments. This is now an ordered environment in which I'm living. I've lived in the opposite. I find this more conducive to mental health, okay? And studies reveal that. I suggested to him also, make sure you're exercising. Give yourself an exercise regimen, even if it's just walking. I mean, I happen to rely upon walking. I walk 8 miles a day, and I make it one of my fundamental duties. There's a famous quotation by Goethe, I've mentioned it in previous lectures. If you would be happy, you must do your duty. And what is your duty? The demand of the hour. Well, I make it the demand of one of my hours to do my walking. I find that if I walk less than that, the next day I'm not feeling quite as good about myself. So it's a relatively simple thing for me to do, and I find as long as I maintain it on a consistent basis, again, I'm imposing a kind of order, in a world that can seem disordered and out of control. I recommended to him, you walk outside, not just inside. It doesn't take very long for us to feel the oppressions, of an environment that's not fully satisfying our needs. We can only go a few minutes without oxygen. We can only go 20, 40 minutes in a cold environment without enough heat. We can only go a few days without water. We can go a few months without food. But in general, we are very vulnerable to fluctuations, changes, derangements in our environment. So I explained to him, so do your walking. make sure you do some of it outside. We can, like within like an environment, we can become sort of claustrophobic, and we can sort of feel disconnected, from systems of support. We are evolutionarily social creatures. Language is a social instrument. It's not that we alone, outside of any social connection, would have thoughts that we could share with ourselves. Without language, we would have no thoughts. And language is primarily an instrument of social coordination, allowing us to thrive when we're otherwise relatively fragile, compared with species, that could threaten us, in the wild. Chimpanzees are much stronger physically than we are. So I emphasized going outside. Studies have shown that exposure to green grass, trees, itself helps elevate our mood. It also exposes you to some people, even if you're not communicating with them, you're seeing them. I emphasize every day have some verbal communication, some oral communication with other people, even if it's on the phone, even if don't just rely upon texting. Actually talk to somebody on a daily basis. It can be your family, it can be friends. But again, it doesn't take very long. I mean, I am an introvert by nature, but if I go 24 hours without any social contact, I will be depressed. In the same way that if I went 24 hours without water, I would be severely dehydrated. I would suffer thirst. So similar thing emotionally. So these are all just instruments, I call it convergences that we can do that would help support us, sustain us. It's a matter of not doing one thing. It's almost never a matter of doing one thing. And even when it can come down to a single thing, usually that single thing has lots of elements itself that make it a robust object. But the more things that we do, the more we can support ourselves emotionally and physically. I also recommend always, we do best, we're instrumental, in our psychology. It's best to have a goal, and it's best to see yourself constantly moving in the direction of that goal, some goal, whatever it might be. So these are all things that can be elements of support for ourselves in a world that's otherwise changed to a point where the traditional supports are no longer present, or not present to the degree that they had been. It's also useful to keep in mind that life is characterized by change. And the normal that we were accustomed to a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, was not necessarily the ultimate level that humanity could achieve. It wasn't as if that normal was Eden. That normal wasn't perfection. We can do better. And often the process of doing better involves leaving behind what we were comfortable with, but what wasn't fully satisfying our needs. So I'm always focused upon the future, and I have aphorisms, actually, more kind of legitimate philosophical aphorisms. The past can't guarantee the future. We don't know what's going to happen next. We suffer when we think we know much more than we do about future circumstances. And the future decides the past. It's very easy to imagine circumstances arising that will transform our whole relationship to the world and make us look back on this period as that necessary transition to something better. I mean, there's a lot more I can say about that, but that's just a general set of guidelines do more than less, and do things that you know to be, in your self-interest. And that includes, going back to that Garrity quotation, trying to avoid procrastination. If you have a task, an obligation, something you can do, whether it's laundry or phone calls or assignments or whatever, the sooner you do them, the more happy you will be, just in general. So again, it's a matter of doing not one thing, but a multiplicity of things. Okay, now, the general issue of what psychiatry has to offer in terms of human circumstances and human emotional stresses is something you find its roots in actually the work of Freud. Now, Freud was a medical doctor, and Freud's interest was not in bringing people to Eden or a utopia or achieving what religions aspire to, right? What the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition might term salvation, or what Buddhism might term enlightenment, a complete and radical solution. That's not been the medical model going back at least to Freud, right? Freud himself was focused upon neuroses, various kinds of, there are two main categories of mental dysfunction. One is neuroses, the other is psychoses. Psychoses are extreme dissociations from reality. You might be hearing things that aren't there. You might be catatonic and not be able to get up out of bed and function at all. When I was in medical school and did psychiatry, I would encounter examples of such individuals. People that would only talk in rhyme, or would engage in some rhythmic activity like bouncing a ball and would not stop, and that was their focus. So I often tell people that when we think we are having mental struggles, we are far from the type of mental issues that severe mental illness presents. Freud himself was not focused upon those extreme mental challenges. He was focused more upon things, like OCD, obsessive compulsive disorders, repetitive behaviors, things of that sort. But the goal of Freud, again, was not to save us. The goal was to free us from these mental encumbrances, these repetitive patterns of behavior that trapped us and that we wanted to escape from, but couldn't. So it was a matter of leading us not, again, to a state of some type of bliss, but leading us to a state of freedom and normality. Okay? That was the goal of Freud, and that's remained the goal of the medical model, not to solve the world in every direction and bring us to mystical union with God, another extreme sort of form, statement of a solution, but to bring us to the point where if we're dealing with something severe, like we're buried alive, well, we suffer that the best we can. Okay. Now, one aspect of the medical model is drug intervention. When I was in medical school, Freud never came up. The name Freud did not once come up, because when I was there, and probably still today, the focus was on developing drugs, antidepressant drugs, other types of drug interventions that could deal with these issues, a whole range of mental issues, without involving psychoanalysis, various types of sessions on a couch. It turns out, in terms of the actual approach that Freud took, it suffered two major setbacks, actually. That is, I guess, at least partly, maybe largely, responsible for its absence from the medical school curriculum. One was Wittgenstein leveled a devastating series of attacks on Freud's results, the kind of presuppositions that were operating within his work. Wittgenstein ultimately characterized Freud's work as a mythology that was pre-scientific, not science per se, and that wasn't capable of the type of rigorous testing that scientific results demand. For example, Freud's early claim to fame was his interpretation of dreams. That was one of the works that he was most proud of, and that was what established, his early reputation. Well, the problem with interpreting dreams is there's no real set of criteria, no way to decide what a correct interpretation of a dream is. So all of Freud's work was interesting reading. It was purely speculative. It was not rigorous. And it did not rise even to the level of a scientific set of results that could be tested. Now, in terms of the psychotherapeutic approaches that Freud undertook, free association and sessions on the couch, talking with the therapist, those were evaluated, and were evaluated in controlled settings where groups of people were with various kinds of, again, neuroses, the types of mental issues that Freud had addressed in his work. People with neuroses were divided into two groups. One group was given psychoanalytic therapies, and the other group was given nothing. And what researchers found was that the same percentage of people improved in both groups. So ultimately, Freud's work did not survive that level of controlled experimental testing. With drug interventions, there is the ability more to assess the effectiveness of a drug on someone's depression, for example, compared to placebo. The problem with drug interventions is when you're taking a pill for something, there's no real effort on your part. There's no dignity associated with the intervention itself. There's a famous line, another line from Goethe, this time from the end of his major work, Faust. What you inherit, you must earn in order to possess. This applies to everything. This applies to philosophical results. This applies to my philosophical results. These are not things that I hand over, you assimilate, and if you find them strong enough, they become part of your life or your thinking. Everything has to be earned to some degree for it to satisfy the demands of human dignity. Again, Wittgenstein had once said that he didn't feel that any of his results would be understood unless people reading them independently arrived at them, that people had done the work themselves that was required. So there's a demand of dignity that we make an effort in some direction. Taking a pill doesn't satisfy that demand. And so it falls short of the level of satisfaction that we really seek in solutions to the issues in our lives. Another thing about drugs are chemicals. The brain is neurochemistry, chemicals, chemical reactions. Thoughts represent chemical processes electrochemical phenomena. If a drug can change brain chemistry, so can a thought. And the process of coming to understand and assimilate a thought can have as profound, and in terms of issues of dignity, of earning, our satisfactions, earning our the benefits that we seek, it's largely, in most instances, superior. So it shouldn't surprise us that a thought like selflessness, how one acts not out of need, can have the power to interrupt physical pain, or can end a phobia in the way that a drug might be able to, though we haven't been yet that successful really in developing targeted drugs in the way that thoughts are actually much more specifically targeted and have probably in the end superior efficacy, effectiveness, power. The religions again attest to the power of thought and or at least the power of belief. If belief has power, then rigorous results have that much more, have in fact the limit of power, or operating at its limit. Okay, so the medical model is not that ambitious in terms of what it's trying to achieve for our well-being. And there are some problems with some of its methodologies. The drug reliance presents some issues. But the most important issue is it's not meant for dealing with extremities of experience. It's not strong enough. And it's not strong enough for a deep reason. It's not strong enough because science, in general, medicine is a science, psychiatry is a science, is not rigorous at the level of philosophic rigor. I've talked a number of times now about the fact that although at the core of science is the controlled experiment, and you take two groups, you give one group a treatment like psychotherapy, you give another group a placebo or nothing and compare. A controlled experiment, even in principle, cannot achieve the level of rigor that philosophy demands of a result. And it's only that level of rigor, as we'll see, that can truly and deeply satisfy us and address our most extreme needs under the most extreme circumstances. And again, if it can do that, it could address issues of a pandemic. Well, and again, the reason why controlled experiments are theoretically impossible is there are a number of ways to say this. We live in an asymmetric space. The world is different in different directions. Somebody over here is in a different environment than somebody over here. When it comes to rigor, the fundamental consideration is difference. Any difference between any two individuals or objects or circumstances means that what applies to one need not rigorously apply to the other. That turns out to be the ultimate condition of human existence, that we differ from everything else. Otherwise, we would assimilate to it, become the other. We don't. We exist. Everything exists because it's in some way different, even if that difference is only a matter of position or a matter of time at a certain place. That is, for rigor, enough. So we exist in difference from everything else. That is the source of our dignity. That, again, any distinction between us and anything else means that we're not replaceable. We are unique. And because we are unique, each and every one of us, whatever applies to anyone else need not apply to us. Where others have failed, we can succeed no matter what. Okay? And there's more to say about that. But I want to deal now with some of these more extreme responses to human needs, emotional needs, our circumstances. And the one that I find particularly compelling and did growing up is Buddhism. And what is especially compelling, what I found especially compelling about it was in the account of the life of the historical Buddha. And I just to give you a little bit of framework, Buddhism originates around 550 BC with Siddhartha Gautama, a historical figure who lived in northern India. He was the son of a chieftain, a tribal leader. He grew up with a privileged type of life. His father supposedly had a premonition or received a premonition that his son would either grow up to be a great warrior or a great spiritual leader, a great military conqueror or a great spiritual conqueror. His father, having been a military leader, a warrior, wanted the same for his son. So he isolated him from anything that might lead him in the direction of a spiritual life. Siddhartha apparently manifested certain sensitivities that suggested he was inclined in that direction, and his father tried to keep him removed from anything that his son might find unsettling. Now, this is part of the legend. It turns out that there is a work by a Buddhist writer, Ashvaghosha, called the Buddha Karita, the Acts of the Buddha. It's a canonical work, which means it's accepted throughout the Buddhist tradition. There are two main branches of Buddhism. There's something called Theravadan Buddhism. That's a type of Buddhism practiced in mostly Southeast Asia and sees the life of Siddhartha Gautama as the life of an individual who was seeking a solution to the problem of human suffering in all of its dimensions. There's another tradition that developed a little bit later, Mahayana Buddhism. It's actually the type practiced, for example, in Japan. Zen Buddhism is an offshoot of that. Chinese Buddhism is an offshoot of that. That tends to see Siddhartha Gautama as one in a line of historical Buddhas. And there's a tendency more to deify that Buddha. The Theravadan tradition, but both traditions look to this work by Ashvaghosha as the source, the genuine source, most authoritative account of the life of Siddhartha Gautama, that either the historical Buddha or that particular Buddha in a long line. Okay? Well, when I read that, there's a passage. According to the legend, according to the work, Siddhartha has been shielded from all of the unpleasantness of life. He's been shielded from disease. He's been shielded from old age. He's been shielded from death. He lives inside the castle or the palace walls, and again enjoys a privileged life. He's married. He has a child, but at about the age of 29, again, according to the legend, he becomes restless and he wants to go outside the palace. Well, his father's concerned about this. He prepares a path for him so that all the beggars, all the, anyone that's sick, any corpses, are removed from the path, and the path is strewn with roses, rose petals. Well, the gods, again, according to the legend, are observing this, and they want the Buddha or Siddhartha to achieve his real destiny, as they see it, of a spiritual leader, a spiritual conqueror. So they, on 3 successive trips out of the palace, they create images for Siddhartha of a diseased man, an old man, and a dead man, corpse. Well, Siddhartha has never experienced that aspect of human life, that reality, and he's overwhelmed. He's shaken to his core. What he decides to do in response to that is interesting. He decides that he needs to find an answer to this extremity of human suffering, which is not something that we're that far removed from, any of us. Disease, old age, death, right? I mean, disease can knock at any point. COVID is now in our midst. Death can happen, to anybody at any time, right? There are all kinds of causes of instantaneous death, and old age, again, seems at this point an inevitable process. Well, Siddhartha decides that he's going to leave the palace and find an answer to these issues, but he tells his charioteer, as he's leaving to seek this solution, something quite extraordinary. He says, tell the people of Kapilavastu, that's the village that he comes from, this, my unshakable resolve. Either I will end disease, old age, and death, and you will quickly see me again, or I will go to perdition, because my powers failed me, and I could not achieve my purpose. Now, it's important when you read something like that there are 2 approaches you can take to that. You can dismiss it, or you can take it somewhat seriously and see what's going on here. What's he really undertaking? What's he really thinking? What's especially important is that the Buddha spends the next 7 years investigating different approaches to these issues, to the emotional and physical and spiritual problems of human life. And at the end of that period, undergoes an episode which is referred to as enlightenment, and he feels he has a solution. Now, he has a solution to what he was seeking, which is to end disease, old age, and death. Now, you can take 2 main approaches to that, and I'll illustrate one of these approaches. Also, when I was at UCLA medical school, I was introduced by the deans to the head of the Neuropsychiatric Institute, because they felt that he was somebody that had certain similarities to me. He was intellectual. They thought he was somebody that I could get along with in that environment. Well, we had a meeting one time, and in the course of that meeting, I was discussing with him Buddhism, what I've just been relaying to you. And when I told him about the Buddha's ambition, and when I told him that the Buddhism exists today because the Buddha felt he had accomplished that goal, the director of the institute said, well, he was arrogant. In other words, he dismissed it. Okay. Well, I talked a few times ago about Wittgenstein's approach to what great minds have achieved, right? That Wittgenstein used a quotation by St. Augustine, whom Wittgenstein considered to be one of those great minds. At the beginning of Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations, a quotation on the nature of language that Wittgenstein felt was wrong, that his philosophical work was meant to counter. But he began with a quotation by St. Augustine because, Wittgenstein wrote, the fact that so great a mind as Augustine held such a belief meant not that the belief was correct, but that it was important, and it had to be investigated. Why? There had to be some power to that belief for so great a mind as Augustine to embrace it. Same thing applies here. Now, if you just dismiss it like, oh, well, he's wrong, then there are things you don't learn that could be of value. Well, that was my approach to those words by Siddhartha. You know, Siddhartha wanted to end disease, old age, and death. He felt he had done it. He wasn't out of his mind, or you could, let's say he wasn't out of his mind. Let's say he wasn't arrogant. Let's say that he felt he had accomplished something substantial. What could he possibly have accomplished? What possibly could be the insights that became the whole Buddhist tradition that followed? And again, that tradition itself has great minds. So just to dismiss something out of hand is itself the arrogance, right? Okay, well, let me explain what Buddhism achieves, what is at the core of the tradition. I know it's ramified, it's grown in different directions, but in terms of what Siddhartha Gautama, the historical Buddha thought he had done, what he felt he had accomplished, and why he felt it had the power that it did, because it's important to understand this in terms of what philosophy does. The key is Siddhartha's final words. Nothing lasts. Final words offer key insights into what people might be thinking. I once was interested in Hitler's personality. I thought he couldn't quite be, the political figure that he's represented as. There had to be some other side to him. But it turns out his final hours were spent dictating tracts, for the future of Germany. I mean, he was committed to his beliefs. It wasn't that he was acting a part. Well, those final words of Siddhartha are the key to understanding how he felt he had ended disease, old age, and death, then and there, in his lifetime, once and for all. He didn't go into a laboratory, right? He didn't achieve a molecular biological cure, for those processes. He didn't have the means of doing that then. We don't have the means of doing that now, okay? Something else had to have been operating. And it turns out there are two ways to end disease, old age, and death. One is the technological approach, to achieve in a laboratory something on that order. The other is to end the concepts. Ending concepts is not a trivial operation. It turns out to be just as difficult as achieving a laboratory cure for something. I sometimes use the example of the concept of the luminiferous ether, something that hardly anybody knows any longer. That concept was effectively ended by Einstein's work. But it took work at the level of Einstein to end that one concept. So ending concepts like disease, old age, and death, that is a challenge. Well, how do you do something like that? Here's how you do something like that. It's based on an analysis. Siddhartha begins with the notion that to exist, to fundamentally exist, is to persist, to last. And the inspiration for that idea is based on comparing what we consider reality to what we consider dream. Right? Dreams are not real because they're not persisting. This reality is persisting. We wake up day after day, regardless of what dreams we might have had, to this persisting environment. This is the reality. So there is an aspect to Siddhartha's analysis that persistence is part of an ultimate reality. And you see this in other areas of philosophical and religious thought, that God genuinely exists or ultimately exists is the ultimate reality because God persists forever. Elementary particles might be seen in physics as the fundamental reality, or the laws of physics as the fundamental reality, because they persist. So it's easy to kind of come to the conclusion that persistence is an important part, an important feature of what's genuinely real. Okay? Well, under the Bodhi tree, when Siddhartha is in meditation and where he achieves his moment of enlightenment, he has a vision. And that's the vision that corresponds to his final words, that nothing lasts. Not a God, not elementary particles, not the laws of physics, not anything. That everything is in a state of constant, perpetual change, flux. There's no underlying, persisting reality. Okay? So, it's actually a logical argument. There's something in logic called a syllogism. It was something that was studied a lot by Aristotle. The most famous example of a syllogism: all men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Okay? The first two statements are called premises. We accept them based upon, our experience. We generalize experience, all men are mortal. That's an observation. It's easy to embrace. Socrates is a man. For whatever reasons, we come to that conclusion. Given those two propositions, those two premises, it follows logically that Socrates is mortal. Okay? The Buddhist syllogism is of this form: the real lasts. That's based on an analysis of the concept of reality. Under the Bodhi tree, Siddhartha has the vision, the insight: nothing lasts. Therefore, the conclusion: nothing is real, including disease, old age, and death. That is the core of Buddhism. That's how Buddhism sort of frees us, or frees its adherents, its believers, from the whole sort of domain of human suffering. Okay? That it's not real. And Buddhism is unlike the medical model, is attempting to achieve a broad scale, a complete solution to the whole range of human suffering. Buddhism sort of has at the beginning of its thought process, where Siddhartha started from, that basically all life is in some fundamental way sorrowful or awry. Something is not right fundamentally with the world. And I mean, you see that actually, that's a fundamental position that religions in general start with. The Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition starts with the fall of man, right? The fall of humanity, in the Garden of Eden, by an act of disobedience against God. The result is disease, mortality, enter the world. Suffering begins as a result of that fall from grace in the garden at the beginning of time. So everything in our subsequent experience is fundamentally unsatisfactory, and it needs a fundamental response. In the case of Christianity, it needs an act of redemption. The Father sends his Son into the world, to suffer on behalf of humanity and restore the humanity, to that kingdom of God, prior to the fall, to heal, that fundamental fall from grace. Okay, but the point is, it's responding to a serious and a broad range of issues, of which something like a pandemic is just a small component. So the only problem with the Buddhist response, though, is that the premise that nothing lasts is a belief. We can't know that nothing lasts. Okay, that effort to end the concepts of disease, old age, and death is based upon a belief. Okay, and so Buddhism is a religion. It's not rigorous philosophy. Now, let me quickly, in terms of, so we see that the way that we can end these issues fundamentally, but within the Buddhist tradition, is to end the concepts. Well, a theist tradition, a tradition that believes in God, is doing a similar thing, but in a different direction, in a different way. If you believe in a God, you believe that all things become one thing, God. The ultimate solution in some of these traditions is mystical union with God. Well, what happens when all things become one thing? What happens, if you might imagine this, let's say all the colors of all the objects in this room became exactly the same color and exactly the same tone, so that there was no contrast between anything that you might be seeing around you. If there's no contrast, if everything becomes exactly the same color and tone, the objects will disappear. Well, imagine all things becoming one thing in God, or in mystical union with God. Again, all distinctions disappear. Concepts are based upon distinctions, based upon grouping things together, but also making distinctions between things that then are grouped together. So believing in a God at the limit of that belief is achieving a similar type of, we might call it a deconceptualization, stripping the world of concepts. The concepts, among others, of disease, old age, and death. But again, that's a belief. The fact that the notion of all things becoming one thing is not something that we see in our experience. What we see in our experience is, in fact, the opposite. And what rigor is achieving that same type of stripping the world of concepts by not imagining all things becoming one thing, which we don't see, but by recognizing what we do see. Namely, that everything is different in different directions, and that we exist in difference from everything else. The ultimate sort of vision, space, I call it, of philosophy is an epistemic space. That's just another term for a philosophic space. And to understand that space, just imagine 2 points. Nothing else in existence, just 2 points. How those 2 points differ, and they differ in position, is what forms an epistemic space. How those 2 points, whatever those 2 points have in common, forms a conceptual space, a heuristic space. We exist ultimately, fundamentally, in an epistemic space where everything is rigorously distinguishable from everything else. And in a space in which everything is rigorously distinguishable from everything else, the concepts that cluster things cannot form. And so philosophy, through its rigor, the limit of its rigor is achieving the kind of elimination of concepts that Buddhism achieves through its analysis of the concept of reality and its supposition about change, and that the Judeo-Christian, Islamic, and other theistic traditions that believe in God, achieve at the limit of their vision by imagining a God where all things become one in that concept. In other words, the limit of convergence of a belief in God achieves a belief that ends concepts in a way that the limit of divergence, which is the rigor of our situation, that everything is distinguishable from everything else at a sufficient level of detail and observation, achieves. And so philosophy is able, but again, it's something that one has to see the world in terms of. We're not accustomed to thinking in terms of the rigor of our circumstance. But that limiting rigor has the power of the religions to end the concepts that are the ultimate source of our suffering, but to end them rigorously, incontestably, not based on a belief or a theory or a point of view. And that is the ultimate power of the philosophical response. That it's not a matter of opinion or point of view, but of an incontestable rigor. Okay, so that's, I think, I guess, do we have some, I could talk more, but if we have questions, I could take some questions.
That's been an amazing lecture, and your speech is always great. And we did have some comments from our viewers. And let me introduce Ansar, who is commenting that he really agrees that philosophy can help if you have problems with mental health. And Ansar also provides us with his personal example, and I'll cite him, and then there is a question from Ansar.
Okay.
I was totally tired and had nothing to do. I could not even figure out what is my past dream and goal. After that, I started listening podcast about Seneca's book, and the topic was about the time. I guess the most valuable thing in our society and world is time. A lot of people sacrifice their time in order to do things that will bring profit for them in the future. And after some time, almost at the end of their life, they say, I have not lived for fullest. They are frustrated. Mr. Friedman, can you give some tips or your opinion about how to couple with this kind of mental issues?
Wait, I'm sorry. Tell me the question one more time, just a question.
Can you give some tips or your opinion about how to couple with this kind of mental issues?
In terms of like having lived a full life or having not wasted one's time, that type of?
I think you could both answer the question about how to deal with the frustration people feel and how to deal with the frustration connected with the time lost.
Okay. First, one thing I always stress is that, again, there are a couple of aphorisms I give. The past can't guarantee the future. So no matter what has happened in the past, that is not a limitation or a barrier to anything that might be possible. We imagine the future taking the basic form of the past. We imagine ourselves limited by what we've been in the past. That's just a belief. Now, it might turn out to be a true belief, but we can't ever know that. Like there's a notion in science, in neuroscience, of hardwiring. That we are wired in a certain way. that wiring sort of establishes our intelligence, establishes our abilities, limits what we can do. Okay, puts kind of almost like a cage around us. Well, we only know that we're hardwiring when we don't break through to some new set of results. So, for example, I like to give the example. I'm not sure this is addressing it, but let me just, okay. I like to give the example of Van Gogh, who at 27 could not draw, had no artistic talent. I've seen drawings of Van Gogh when he began his career. He was somebody that had he presented those drawings to a drawing academy to undertake study to become an artist would have been the basis for his rejection. He had less talent for drawing than Adolf Hitler, who famously, did not succeed in gaining entry to a drawing academy that he was aspiring to. Van Gogh had less talent. And yet Van Gogh, through his persistence, became, in 10 years, the most popular became the foundation, created the work that would, 100 years later, make him recognized as the most popular great painter who's ever lived. So we impose kind of limitations upon ourselves. I also like to stress that we don't know the direction of events, and we don't know ultimately what's in our best interest. We might think that a certain direction, we might think that the current direction of society, away from the past normality is a loss. We might feel that we're suffering the loss of something, but events can change that. The future decides the past. Like what happens tomorrow or the next day or the day after that can transform our whole sense of the past. But I'm having a sense that I'm not maybe totally in tune with the question. Did some of that address it or not really?
If Ansar is still with us, we could kindly ask him to provide more details on his question. But there is another question. Okay. He's asking, what is life in terms of philosophy?
What is life in terms of philosophy? Okay. First of all, the most important thing about life in terms of philosophy is it's not characterizable, in the sense that there's a famous statement by the French existentialist philosopher Sartre. Existence precedes essence. When we attempt to characterize life, it's as if we're characterizing it from the outside. It's as if we are writing a novel, like in the third person, looking down on the world and giving our assessment of it from a distance. That's not the reality of our circumstance. The most important feature of our circumstance is that we can't remove ourselves from the world. And so we can't see it from the outside. All we can do in our circumstances is to create it. And what we create is the essence of each of us is a world. Each of us is experiencing what has never been experienced by anyone before and will never be experienced by anyone ever again. So we want to kind of deal with the details of our circumstance and recognize that we can't judge others, because we can't know their circumstances. We can't enter their world, their life, their skin, and leave ours behind. Not only can we not do that, God can't do that. If you imagine a God, God cannot judge us because he can't fully occupy our skin and only our skin, to see the world only through our eyes. So it's not a question of what is life, it's a question of what is our life. And what do we see as our responsibility to the world that presents itself to us? And I tell people that our fundamental responsibility is to address whatever issues we see as they present themselves to us in our world. We can't step outside of it. It's the fundamental illusion, to think that we can, and it's the ultimate source of human suffering, it turns out, to think that we can. So we can answer questions. We can answer a question, what is our life? And our life is a matter of what we're experiencing and what we feel called upon by our whatever our nature is, and whatever the world that we are uniquely experiencing presents itself to us as. But in terms of the general characterization of life, that would involve a characterization of all lives, and that is not rigorously achievable. And so, since it's not rigorously achievable, it's not part of philosophy. It's part of science or anthropology, but it's not rigorous. And because it's not rigorous, ultimately, it doesn't matter. It's not decisive in terms of the deep nature of existence, which is, again, something that we cannot leave behind and view from the outside. Within that circumstance, we're sort of eternal, right? We cannot leave the world even to experience our own death. Death itself is, from our standpoint, rigorously just a rumor, not a reality. If somebody asks you, what kind of world would it be in which we did not know that death was certain? This world, because that's the nature of our specific circumstance. And you don't want, philosophy does not seek a general characterization for life. It tries to come to terms with the circumstances of your life as it presents itself to you, and the responsibility you feel as you experience that world that only you can ever experience.
Yeah, here is the clarification from Ansar. I mean, how can I eliminate this feeling about that I have not ostensibly enough something in my life?
I have not enough.
There is something always lacking in his life.
Oh, okay. Okay, first of all, you don't want to be comparing your life to others. Okay, it's your, you again, what you are experiencing now has not been and will never be experienced again. So you have to embrace your circumstance. The solution to the world has to be available to you right here, right now, or it's not available to anyone, anywhere. So the best guidance that's often given when you feel that something is lacking is you want to pay more attention to your specific circumstances, to the details of your world. You want to appreciate the fact that what you are experiencing is unique in all the history of the world. And you want to become basically more aware of. To be aware of your world is to become more aware of yourself. But an essential part of that process is to try not to live through what you imagine to be other people's eyes or other people's experience. You want to try, and it's not an easy thing to do because we live in a social environment that encourages us, where we're communicating with others. But it's a very difficult thing to learn to see the world through your own eyes. And once you do that, you'll be overwhelmed with the abundance of that world. But it's a matter of paying attention to what is around you in its full detail. In other words, when you're feeling that something is lacking, it's because you're not fully seeing what is right in front of your eyes. And the best way, and the way you know you're not seeing what's in front of your eyes is most people, very few people can draw as well as Rembrandt can. Well, Rembrandt can draw the way he did because he was seeing what was in front of his eyes. If you have trouble drawing objects, it's because you're not seeing. You must, so that's one of the best ways to learn to see, to learn to draw. And to the degree that you're not able to draw means that you're not seeing what you need to see, which is, and there's a famous quotation from a philosopher, Alfred North Whitehead, an early 20th century philosopher. He said, what matters most, what's most decisive, are circumstances of such great generality that no one ever sees them because they're always right in front of our eyes. That's the most important thing to come to terms with. What's there, not what's across the street, or not what you're imagining someone else experiencing, but like I've been emphasizing in some of the previous talks, the whole point of Einstein's work is that each one of us is the still center of existence. And the only way that you would not appreciate that is if you are seeing the world from outside, which you can't do. So you have to come to terms with where you are, what's in front of your eyes, what you're not seeing. And again, like one of the obvious things, the significance of the world being different in different directions, or the significance of the fact that the past can't guarantee the future no matter what, and the future decides the past no matter what. So you're capable of, so far as you can ever know, becoming or achieving anything. The only limitation is what you place upon yourself. And if you say, yes, but I can try and try and try, and I still haven't gotten to where I want to be, keep trying. You only know that you're not going to achieve that goal when you give up. So whatever that goal or whatever that vision is, whatever, and one of the important guidelines is a Hindu proverb that I like to emphasize with people. You become what you admire. So what you want to do is try to find that which you most truly, deeply admire, not what the world admires, not what other people celebrate, but what you fundamentally, profoundly respect. And that can take some like self-searching, some analysis. That it might be something in your parents' relationships, or in family, or it's not typically like a profession that the world tends to look up to. It's usually something much more specific and focused on your circumstances. And once you become aware of that and pursue that, then you have the real possibility of genuine satisfaction in your life. The important thing is not to pursue other people's admirations, but to pursue your own.
Thank you. These are very important and useful tips, as it was said in the question. Thank you so much. And I just wanted to remind our viewers interesting fact about you, that Mr. Friedman is actually a great artist, and his works also presented and represented every year in famous American galleries. And you might find it interesting, like we would like to see Mr. Friedman's work as well, like in real life. So maybe one day we will. We hope to.
Actually, one time, if you like, I can talk about some of my work. I could spend a little time talking about the art and what I do.
With pleasure. So next time when we pick up the topic, we can devote some time for the topic. So thank you very much to all who joined us today, and we are looking forward for our next meeting. It will take place next Friday, the same time. So please stay tuned and get your questions ready by the next time. So if something was not clear in today's session, you can address it in the next. And we will update all of you in our social media. And please, if you missed our previous sessions with Mr. Friedman, you're welcome to watch all of them in our YouTube channel, Kazakhstan American Corners YouTube channel. So it is all by now, but today we wish a very wonderful day to all of you and wonderful night for those who live in the other hemisphere. So see you. Goodbye.
Thank you very much. Goodbye, everybody. And hopefully I'll see you next week. Thank you so much.